Hi, everybody. This is Glenn Loury. You've tuned into The Glenn Show. I'm here with my regular conversation partner, John McWhorter, and our special guest this week, who is Jens Ludwig, who's professor at the University of Chicago, an economist and criminologist who's the author of the new book out from the University of Chicago Press called Unforgiving Places, The Hidden Origins of American Gun Violence. So thanks for joining us, Jens.
Thanks so much for having me on. I'm really delighted to be here.
And it's good to see you again, John. It's been a while since we talked.
It's been a bit. That's right. It's summer now. That's right.
Yeah, we're taking a month break here in the month of June. This conversation won't post until sometime in July, but I miss you, John.
I miss you too, Glenn. We've got to get it going again. Where did we get lost?
Jens, tell us a little bit about yourself. How do you come from Germany to the United States to be a leading expert on gun violence in the country?
Yeah, maybe not the most common path. Good question. So I was born in Germany. I came over when I was 3, and I went to Rutgers for college between 1986 and 1990. For those of listeners who don't know Rutgers, it's located in New Brunswick, New Jersey, sort of a medium-sized city. When I was there, this is when the crack cocaine epidemic was sweeping over cities all over the country. I was a volunteer soccer coach for the New Brunswick Recreation Department. We would field as many kids as I could fit into my little Ford Escort that I was driving around at the time. So if you know anything about soccer, you would realize we weren't very good because you can't fit 11 kids into an Escort.
That was my first car too, actually.
Yeah. It's and the thing that really made a big impression on me was, driving around to pick the kids up for the games and then drop them off, and see the sort of neighborhood environments and challenges that moms were facing in raising their kids. And I sort of first generation college goer, I sort of backed into economics as a major, and I thought, I'm not really interested in stock price movements or something. Like, this feels like a really important thing that I can see that we haven't solved. Maybe the tools of economics might have something that could potentially be useful in helping with that. And so that's what got me really interested in that.
I see. Hidden origins. I mean, don't we already know what the problem is with gun violence? And the problem is guns. Guns in the hands of the wrong people, and circumstances that promote violent behavior that we could remedy with social policy. What's hidden about that?
Yeah. So, maybe to start with the guns part of the equation. I think a lot of people look at the huge difference. So the United States is really an outlier among rich countries in the world in our murder rate. We're just off the charts compared to any other developed country. And almost all of that American exceptionalism in terms of like excess murders here are driven by gun murders. So it's not that Americans are intrinsically more violent or whatever, because our non-gun murder rate is not that different, but we're just off the charts because of our gun murder rate. So a lot of people look at that and say, well, surely it's just the fact that we have 400 million guns in a country of 330 million people. Surely, like, the one and only solution is to get rid of 400 million guns. And I think maybe the first thing to say is we are not getting rid of 400 million guns anytime soon. That's not a very bold empirical prediction, but I think we can all see that that's true. And I think we can also see that it's very unlikely that there are going to be big changes in federal gun policy anytime soon. So, like, if the only thing that you could do about the gun violence problem was guns, you'd be super depressed. The good news is that there is, like, if you look at like Canada and Switzerland, for instance, they have the exact same rate of gun ownership, but Canada has a murder rate that's multiple times higher in Switzerland. So that tells you that guns and gun availability is part of what's going on, but not the entirety of it. And so the way that I've come to think about it, this gets to the last part of your question. The way that I've come to think about it is that gun violence is guns plus violence. If the gun part of things are, for better or for worse, depending on your politics, stuck in the United States for the foreseeable future, we need to be kind of diversifying what we're doing to try and address the problem and think a lot more about what's driving violent behavior. As you point out, lots of people think the solution is as simple as just ending poverty in America. And I think I understand why people believe that, but I think from spending 30 years looking at the data, I conclude that that's not the case. And we need to start to think in different ways about how we change the willingness of people to use these 400 million guns to hurt one another.
Jens, can I ask you something?
Of course.
This is, I love the thesis. It's a great book, but I think I have a question that anybody, especially who hasn't read the book, is going to have. And I'm sure you understand it's a real question. We're talking about this thing where the term of art nowadays is gun violence. I think all three of us and anybody instantly in the base of their brain associate that with Black people. We're talking about things going on Southside Chicago, et cetera. And I want to know, because I hate to say this, but part of what you're talking about has always struck me as, and the lightning is going to strike me, cultural. As in, stop and frisk went way too far in New York City until 2013. And crime kept going down after they stopped doing it, which said to me, one, good. But then two, it seems that the stopping and frisking, although they really overdid it, changed the culture. It changed what was seen as a norm in those tough neighborhoods. And I found myself thinking very simply this: is this a problem in white communities too? Or are we really talking about what happens with the hamburger shop in Southside Chicago? And that doesn't mean that we can't fix it, but I don't read much about this happening among white people. I know that there's violence that results from the drug epidemic among poorer whites, et cetera. But is it like this? And the answer might be yes.
Yeah, it's a great question. Maybe let me answer it in two parts. So the first thing that I would say is, in cities like Chicago, it is overwhelmingly Black victims and Black offenders. So I think the last year of data I saw, it's something like 80% Black victims. And you see that in cities all around the country. I think the fact that our media consumption is driven by what happens in cities has led us to overstate the degree of overrepresentation of Blacks as victims and offenders. And so if you look, there are a lot of poor people in Michigan and Southern Illinois and Indiana that you just never read about in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. When you look at the national data, you can see that about half of all gun violence victims in America gun homicide victims are Black. So it's massively overrepresented, but at the national level, it is not as overwhelmingly driven by Black victims and offenders as it is in the cities. And so a very important part of the problem is also occurring among low-income white communities and Hispanic communities. And then I think the other thing that I would, I try and really argue in the book is this was one of the really big surprises for me in doing this research and working on the book, which is that criminal behavior, even the most serious types of crime, like gun violence, turns out, not all of it, but a much, much larger share of it than I think I had ever appreciated myself, is a lot more like normal human behavior than I had understood originally. And it stems from things that all of us do. And the main thing that's different is the situations in which we find ourselves determine the consequences, the severity of the consequences that result from what I would argue is universal behavior. We can get into that more, but I do think it's like the behavior is universal, the situations determine the consequences. And I think there's a lot that we can do. And I think that's good news because I don't know of any great study myself that gives us a button to push. If it were culture, it's like, what policy button do we push to change culture? I don't know. I think what it actually is something that is much more actionable, which is great news because I think it creates the potential to save lots of lives.
We live in turbulent times, and the partisan nature of media isn't making it any easier to keep up with the news. We all need tools to cut through the noise, spot bias, and see the full picture. The tool I use for this is Ground News. It's the website and app I rely on daily to stay informed, cut through the noise, and get closer to the truth. Visit ground.news/Glenn Show to see for yourself how it works. My favorite feature of Ground News is the blind spot feed. It shows you stories that are disproportionately reported by either the left or the right, about 20 such stories every day. Let me take a look at it now to show you what I mean. Here's a story the right is covering and the left isn't. Chief Rabbi condemns BBC's mishandled response to anti-IDF chanting at Glastonbury. And here's an example of the opposite. This one is a story covered by the left, but not the right. U.S. contractors say their colleagues are firing live ammo as Palestinians seek food in Gaza. For both of these and for every story, Ground News gives you a breakdown of the sources covering it, the bias of the media outlets reporting across the left, right, and center, how reliable these sources have been in the past, and who owns them. This is the kind of news analysis you won't find anywhere else. Right now, my viewers can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan, which is the same plan I use. Make sure you subscribe using my link at ground.news/Glenn Show. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code when signing up. That's ground.news/Glenn Show.
Let's talk about the numbers a little bit. What is the difference in homicide rates by class and by race in the United States?
Well, if I look in Chicago for starters, okay. That's the city that I know best. The homicide victimization rate for whites in Chicago in recent years is something on the order of like 2 or 3 or 4 per 100,000, depending on what year you look at. And the homicide victimization rate for blacks in Chicago is on the order of 50 or 60 or 70 per 100,000, depending on what year you look at. And
that's 3 or 4 per 100,000 versus 60 or 70 per. Yeah. That's an order of magnitude.
Yes. And that disparity has been, at least in Chicago, has been widening over time. And so, we spend a lot of time in the United States for excellent reason worrying about inequality in income and inequality in wealth and lots of other things. And I totally get why we do that, and it's appropriate and useful. I think we don't spend nearly enough time worrying about inequality in something that's even more basic in people's lives, which is public safety. I lived on the South Side for 18 years. You drive around the South Side, you talk to countless parents who will literally not let their kids go 3 doors down to the corner store to get milk. Kids come home from school, they're basically in lockdown. And they're just not part of the conversation of inequality in America. And I think it really deserves to be much more so.
The thing that worries me about this is that, as you're saying, we have to always think of solutions. And it's very hard, like the story of the mother who goes into the hamburger joint and gets into an altercation with a man, and her son comes in with the gun from her glove compartment and shoots the man in the back. And then the woman tells the boy to chase the man out and shoot him again, which he does, and the man is killed. The sad thing is how easy it is to imagine that story if you're familiar with the culture. And the first thing I'm thinking is, here is somewhere where it's considered normal to have a gun in the door of your car, and that your kid would go get it and maybe have shot a gun before, all of this feeling very normal. She has it because she feels she needs to protect herself. But then again, she also tells her son to go chase the man. There's a sense of norm in that area. And I can imagine it's also where J.D. Vance grew up. But the norms among these people involve that you have a gun. I've probably held a gun once. It was 1977, and it was kind of for show. I don't know anybody well who has a gun. And if anybody found that I had one, it would be considered a horror. I'm in this upper middle class building. I'll bet there isn't a gun in any of these 78 apartments. They all have guns. What will we do to change that sense of norm is what worries me. And I know you present some solutions, but wow. And I'm saying culture, and maybe we're talking about class. It's not race, but we don't have any guns.
Before you answer, Jens?
Yep, please.
Which is, you're an economist, you know a little bit about game theory. Isn't it an equilibrium if I'm living in an environment, this is apropos of John's point, where I can anticipate, should I get into a dispute with someone, they're going to be armed, to arm myself. And that's not, I mean, you can call that culture if you want to, but there's nothing intrinsically racial about that. That's the fact that the situation I find myself in is one in which in a self-reinforcing way, everybody is armed.
Yeah. And to your point, Glenn, when criminologists go out and do surveys of people and they ask them, like, have you ever carried a gun? And if so, in public, and if so, why? One of the key answers essentially is, I'm carrying a gun because I'm worried about my safety because everybody else has got a gun. And so I think, big cities in America often, because of the concern about the costs of stop and frisk and the way that was, I think many people believe, overdone in New York City. We could have a conversation about that. I think big cities are often ambivalent about what to do about illegal gun carrying in public. And the danger is that can create a vicious cycle in which more people carry guns, which leads more people to carry guns. And then, Glenn, to your point, you wind up in an equilibrium that is really not great. I think anything that you do to reverse that has the potential to turn that vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle. And I think what you're starting to see in Chicago is maybe half a step in that direction, starting with maybe not necessarily all illegal gun carrying, but I think the prosecutor in Chicago is starting to worry, at least start with the carrying of guns that are like excessively lethal, if that term even makes sense. You've got kids on the south and west sides of Chicago with semi-automatic handguns and 100-round drums and machine gun conversion devices or Glock switches that let you fire the 100 rounds in like 30 seconds. And so at the very least, deterring that and getting that off the street seems like a good first step. But again, I think like in the meantime, a big part of this has to be like just changing the willingness of people to use the guns to hurt one another. And I've got ideas about what we might do about that.
Well, Jens, one of them. Oh, go ahead, Glenn.
No, I was just going to ask why you don't see the same kind of behavior amongst low-income whites, Asians, and to the extent that you see it amongst Latinos, what would account for the difference vis-a-vis Blacks?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like, shifting ahead a little bit to the solution part of this, I think the neighborhoods that you see, like if you drive around Chicago and you go to the neighborhoods where the gun violence problem is concentrated on the south and west sides, you don't need to know Chicago very well to realize like this is not what the north side and the downtown of the city look like, right? And the level of, like, I don't know, Glenn, the last time you were in your hometown of the south side of Chicago, but like I spent many years trying to understand the gun violence problem, driving around with Chicago cops. And it's like, if you want a bottle of water in Englewood, there was a long stretch where you'd have to drive to the CVS outside of Englewood on the other side of the Dan Ryan to get it, kind of thing. So these are neighborhoods that have like been completely depopulated. There's just no kind of social infrastructure. And I argue like that sort of severity, you don't see, I guess in very, very low income white rural communities, you might have seen something like 60, 70, 80% of the people who used to live there move out. But there's not tons of places around the country that have been that depopulated and under-resourced. And the predominantly Black neighborhoods in Chicago are some of the few communities that are very clearly in that category. And I think undoing that, or at least trying to chip away at that, turns out to be an important part of the solution to this.
And so, that it's that desolate hellscape post-60s urban American neighborhood. And I'm just thinking, change all the faces to white, like do a thought experiment. Would there be the same kind of violence? And maybe this all just becomes idle. But one thing that worried me was one of your proposed solutions, and I'm sure you can just fill it in. You were saying that violence prevention programs work, that they have an effect, that you can chip away at a good 50% of the potential violence by teaching, say, pairs of guys how to negotiate. And that part just worried me in that, let's go back in time. It's 1975, where we come in the car and we stop in front of a church on Saturday. We go into the church and nobody has phones. It's 1975. But down the hall, there is this burly black guy who's probably an ex-con. And there are about 16 black teens in there. They've got big afros and combs in them. This is another time. But that's the point. That long ago, there already were those programs. There's always some guy, or often it's some older Maya Angelou type woman. And yet these things come and they go, the crime rates fluctuate, et cetera, but things never really significantly change on the basis of teaching guys how to keep it calm. Am I being too pessimistic about that? Is there a way to scale that up?
Yeah, I do. I do think. I do think that you are maybe being a little bit too pessimistic, and maybe as a way, like maybe as a little bit of stage setting to like the solutions and the ideas. Let me just situate my argument for what is driving gun violence in contrast to the conventional wisdom that is about what people thought was driving gun violence, but which I think is not the case.
So the hidden origins.
Yeah. So, like, if you look at the survey data, you can see that most Americans, when you ask them, why do people engage in crime and violence? Most Americans break up into two camps. So one camp is, I know exactly what is driving violence. It is immoral people who are unafraid of the criminal justice system and whatever it's going to do to them. And that leads you to think that the only thing that you can do to solve the problem is stiffer prison penalties, basically bigger sticks. And the people who don't fall into that camp, the overwhelming majority of them fall into another camp, which will sound familiar, which is violent behavior, criminal behavior is just due to economic desperation. These are people who are trying to feed themselves, feed their families, are going to do whatever it takes. The only solution is to disincentivize crime and violence by improving the alternatives to crime so people aren't so desperate that they have to do that. And what's interesting about, the left and the right don't agree on very much, but it's interesting to observe that there's an implicit agreement there that before anybody pulls a trigger, they're engaging in some sort of deliberate weighing of pros and cons, right? This is, Glenn, you're an economist like me. This is sort of the famous argument by my former University of Chicago colleague, Gary Becker, that like criminal behavior is rational behavior. And the data suggests that does seem to be true for property crimes, right? That there really is some deliberation. There are lots of good evidence that is deterrable by like the things that people would think. But I think where that intuition breaks down is gun violence itself is not what we think. Again, this goes a little bit back to media representation that's not actually representative. The gang wars over drug selling turfs or the murders that are due to robberies are way overrepresented in news coverage. I point this out in the book. The overwhelming majority of gun violence in America is actually like arguments. You stepped on my sneaker, you won't apologize, and now somebody winds up shot and somebody winds up in cuffs. That is not the moment in which most of us are at our maximally deterrable selves. And, you can see that in the data, and I just think, it's like, no wonder for 100 years, our policies have been built on changing incentives. It's like we've been trying to cure cancer with heart disease medication. No wonder we have not had the success that we want. And I think the policy approach that's going to be more effective is going to be something that recognizes gun violence for what it is and is more about not deterring violent behavior in those heated moments, but interrupting them. And we can talk about what that looks like, including the guy in the church and this other stuff. But I think directionally, we just need a mindset shift and a course correction if we're going to make much more progress on this. And we can talk about the evidence and what those policies look like. But I think at a high level, it is re-understanding the problem that I think is maybe the most important thing that I hope people get from the book.
We have misdiagnosed the problem. We think it's either one of bad character or of economic desperation. We think people are motivated by or deterred by rational calculation and incentives. when in fact these are crimes that happen in the moment. They're situational. They're acts of passion. We have to take a behavioral, not a rational calculation approach to analyzing it. And you think you've got the answer.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me just clarify. So I'm not like overclaiming. I was trained as a garden variety economist, back in the late 1800s. I got my PhD. I read Gary Becker. I believed all of that stuff. And it was more through, after a doctoral student was shot and killed at the University of Chicago 2 weeks after defending their dissertation, I started this research center at the University of Chicago called the Crime Lab that started to work with nonprofits all over the city and government agencies. And so just the thing to clarify is my thinking was shifted, kicking and screaming, by a bunch of really clever insights and observations that nonprofits and frontline government workers had about the problem. And I think the contribution of the book is sort of summarizing the wisdom. The frontline practitioners have been seeing this problem very clearly. And I think what the book tries to do is present evidence that their intuitions are actually right, and then provide sort of a conceptual framework around to make sense of how a very disparate series of kind of policy levers are actually all acting on the same underlying thing, and that there's sort of a coherent picture. But it's like I would not give myself any credit for this. It's just like they're just super, super smart people who care a lot about this problem and have learned a lot. And I hope the book kind of puts a spotlight on that.
And I want to try something just because I'm nagged by this, and I want to see all of this your way because I can tell that you're right, but I'm nagged by something. There's a story. The national media are not picking up on it for reasons I think I understand. But about 2 months ago, a Black teen named Carmelo Anthony, somewhere in Texas, I believe, was in a tent. I think it was either lacrosse or rugby. Some sport was involved. That's a weak point of mine, but one of those. In a tent belonging to these two white twins. Their last name is Metcalf. I forget their first name. He was not supposed to be in the tent. Why he insisted on being in the tent has not been made clear yet. But the white boys asked him to leave, and he refused. And then they got closer to him and touched him, and he had a bag. And he said, "Touch me and see what happens." And so they kept touching him. Carmelo Anthony stabbed one of the boys, one of the twins, in the heart, and he died. He ran, and then he gave himself up, and he said that he did it because, quote unquote, he put his hands on me. Now, this is what I can't get past.
Yep.
A white boy wouldn't have done that. Now, that's a vast overstatement, but...
Yeah, how do you know that, John?
Yeah.
Because if there were a scene like that, and especially if you're people like us and you've always got your eyes peeled for things like this, the white boy would not kill the Black twins. As in, if that ever happened, we'd hear about it because that white boy would be celebrated as evidence of racism, etc. It was partly something about Carmelo Anthony. It was partly that there's an element of some Black culture that says that it's okay to go off, that you don't hold it in. Huh?
Let me offer, if I can, let me offer a behavioral economics interpretation of that. Right. So the argument that I make in the book is that, one of the big breakthroughs in behavioral economics over the last couple of decades is that our minds work in a way that is very different from how we think. So when we think about thinking, we think of the little voice in our head. That gives us the capacity to do rational things and invent the internet and whatever. It doesn't mean that it's always rational, but to the extent to which we can. And so in Danny Kahneman's amazing book, Thinking Fast and Slow, that I hope everybody reads because it's just such a profoundly important book. In that book, he refers to that as like slow thinking or system 2 thinking. And that's very, very powerful, but it's very mentally taxing. Just think about the last time you spent 15 minutes doing the crossword or the Wordle or something on the New York Times website. You're exhausted. You've got to go do something else. And because that sort of deliberate slow thinking is so mentally taxing, our minds have evolved to do a different type of thinking that we're not even aware of, that happens below the level of consciousness, a series of automatic responses that are fast, effortless, and adaptive that is useful for a bunch of, or usually useful for a bunch of routine things that we see over and over again in our daily lives. So Kahneman calls that thinking one or fast thinking, whatever you would want to call it. Now, here's why I think that's relevant, John, to the example that you gave. So, and I'm gonna tell you a little story, and you're gonna be like, "That's just a story," and then I'm gonna try and convince you that there's something to the story with some data behind it. So I'm not just BSing you. So, I think one of the things that we know from a big body of research in sociology, from driving around talking to teachers and kids and cops and social workers and whatever in different neighborhoods, in under-resourced neighborhoods, the adults are overwhelmed. And just give you a very, very quick story about this. I was driving around with the commander in the Englewood neighborhood a few years ago. We're on 63rd Street, one of the big east-west, it's 2 lanes in each direction. Car in front of us is a Friday night. Car in front of us is swerving across all 4 lanes. I turned to the commander and I said, "I think that guy's drunk." And he said, "I do too." And I said, and he slams on the brakes and he puts a big distance between us and the other car. I said, "Aren't you going to do anything? You're not just the cops, you're the cop. You're the commander of Englewood." He's like, "Jens, if I stopped every drunk driver in Englewood, I would not have time to worry about the real problem in Englewood, one of the most violent neighborhoods in the city, which is gun violence." And I think that speaks to this idea that both formal and informal social control is easily overwhelmed in under-resourced neighborhoods. So now I'm a kid growing up in Englewood, and I'm walking to school, and this is going to be the behavioral economics theory of the phenomenon that you're describing, John, and then I'm going to try and convince you that there's data to prove it. So I'm walking to school and someone challenges me for my lunch money. In a neighborhood where formal and informal social control, like the adults are just overwhelmed, I can't turn to an adult for help. My system one, I argue, learns pretty quickly that if I hand over my lunch money today, I've just signaled to everybody else in the neighborhood that I'm an easy victim. You take my lunch money today, tomorrow you're coming back for my jacket, the next day you're coming back for my phone. Like, that's it. It's over for me. And so system one learns below the level of consciousness, when I'm challenged, that's a routine situation I see over and over again, I fight back. And notice the severity of the fight back need not be proportional to the provocation, because it is not backward-looking retribution to what you just did to me. It is forward-looking signaling to everybody else in the neighborhood. And notice the important part of this is because it is system one fast thinking, all of these sort of stimulus response connections are developed below the level of consciousness. We're not even aware of this, right? We all have these sort of system one responses. We're not aware of this. And that leads to what from the outside can look like overreactions when those responses are overgeneralized, including when someone's got a gun, when someone's got a knife, like whatever it is. So that's my sort of theory. It's like, the key insight with behavioral economics is not just that people make mistakes, but that there's some predictable structure. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason that I would argue that is not just a story, that there's really something to it, is the very first experiment. So, I'm an empirical economist. I believe in the power of data and science to promote social progress, like in the same way that the FDA requires any new medication to have a randomized controlled trial as evidence before you give it to a patient. I think we should be doing something similar in the public policy space. The very first experiment we did was a test of a program called Becoming a Man, run by a Chicago area nonprofit called Youth Guidance. And it's middle school, high school age, men, boys, I don't know what you would describe, teenagers on the south and west sides of Chicago. They bring them into a room. And like Glenn and I would be a pair, and they would give me a rubber ball. They'd say, this is the first exercise the kids do. It's called the fist exercise. They'd say, Glenn, you've got 30 seconds to get the ball out of Jens's hands. Go. And what does Glenn do? Most of the kids in Glenn's situation basically beat the crap out of his partner for 30 seconds. Glenn will try and pry my hand open, doesn't work, breaks my pinky, puts me in a headlock, starts punching me in the stomach. The BAM counselor calls time. We switch. I do the same to Glenn. Then we debrief. And the BAM counselor then will say, Glenn, what strategies did you try? Glenn said, I pried his hand open. It didn't work. He's stronger than he looks, blah, blah, blah. And the BAM counselor will say, Glenn, why didn't you ask him for the ball? So youth guidance has now done BAM with something like, I think the numbers are something like 10,000 kids in Chicago over the last decade. And they tell me that not more than like a dozen kids ever asked. So it's really quite striking. And the kids in Glenn's situation will say, oh, if I would have asked Jens for the ball, he would have thought I was and you can imagine what kids fill in there. And then the kicker is the BAM counselor will turn to me and say, Jens, what would you have done if Glenn asked you for the ball? And I said, I'd just give him the ball. It's just a stupid rubber ball. Who cares? Much better than having my pinky broken and put in a headlock and punch. And you can see, like, notice what that program is not doing. It's not ending poverty. It is not threatening people with stiffer punishments. What it is doing is it's engaging, and it's through show not tell. It is getting kids to be a little bit more skeptical of whatever system one, fast thinking, is putting into their heads. To get them to be a little bit more system two and deliberate in these sort of high stakes moments that lead to violence. So you're like, well, that surely can't work. We did a randomized experiment, just like they do in medicine, and we used police data to measure violent crime arrest rates for kids. So we're not relying on kids' self-reports so you worry that they're lying to you. We see a 50% reduction in violent crime arrests, also a reduction in arrests for weapons offenses.
That's comparing people who went through the program with those who did not.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you. Sorry. And then we redid it, and we basically see the same thing again. Now, whether that would work if you give it to 1 million kids is an open question, but as proof of concept of what is driving the behavior, I don't see how you can look at that evidence and not be moved off of your original conventional wisdom position. Like, you've just got to update in your thinking about what's going on, in my view.
But I must say, it's hard to believe that I could alter the landscape of a high crime area city with a lot of people with guns and a lot of homicide by this kind of an exercise. I mean, that's kind of asking a lot for me to believe that.
Yeah, let me try and this is one of the two sorts of approaches that I think we can try, but let me try and convince you, let's see if this is successful, that there's more scalability here than you might think. So, if you look at the data from the Chicago Police Department, 90% of the offenders for murders in Chicago, 90% of the offenders and 80% of the victims have an arrest record. So one way to think about that is almost everybody involved in gun violence in Chicago has passed through the criminal justice system. We, in principle, had a chance to do something developmentally productive with them to make their lives better, and we blew it. We missed it.
We had a captive audience, but we didn't make use of the captivity.
Perfectly said. Perfectly said. And we did the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center in Chicago out on the west side on Roosevelt Road. This is where the juvenile justice system holds the kids that they think are highest risk for violence. And we did a thing with the Juvenile Detention Center where, like, the kids would go to the Nancy B. Jefferson Chicago Public School in the morning, and then in the afternoon, they'd sit in the common room watching TV as a detention guard stood against the wall watching the kids watch TV. So we're talking to the administrator, and he's like, I think that we can do better than 6 hours of TV. And he basically, with no money, trained the guards to deliver a BAM-like program to the kids. And you see a 20% reduction. This is also a randomized experiment. You see a 20% reduction in recidivism for the highest risk kids for free. We can do that. We should be doing that in every juvenile detention facility and every jail and every prison. That's not going to solve the problem, but boy, a bunch of 20% reductions for free is a really important first step on the problem. And let me just sort of I think the structure of the opportunity is we've got an institution that's working with a lot of young people and has low value or low opportunity cost time. Let me just give you one other example in the spirit of what public health people would call primary prevention. I went to Lenape High School in Medford, New Jersey, and the state of, if I'm remember, this was 100 years ago, so I might be misremembering, but I believe that the state of New Jersey, in its wisdom, made me take 4 years of health education. And what did we do in that? They told me that I should be eating more broccoli. They told me that I should be sleeping 8 hours a night, and they told me where babies come from. Not super helpful. And if you look at the data on what is actually killing American adolescents. It is homicide, as we started with, disproportionately so in low-income minority communities. It is suicide. It is drug overdoses, and it is car crashes. So the things that's actually threatening American adolescents is what you might call, there's been a lot of talk of deaths of despair. I would call these deaths of decision-making. And these sorts of BAM-like programs, I think there's an accumulating body of evidence that suggests you only need like 15 to 20 hours of exposure to these sorts of ideas and exercises to materially change people's decision-making and behavior. Like, why in the world? Imagine that we did that for 3 weeks in every health curriculum, and every detention facility was doing this sort of program with their staff for free. You would start to see this. You wouldn't need a randomized control trial to see this. You would start seeing these in the aggregate numbers, like murder rates would start going down. I really believe that hypothesis. I wish that we would do it to test that hypothesis.
I think this, of course, as you know, makes perfect sense, and you can't argue with the data. It sounds like this is an effective way to combat something that set in. I can't wrap my head around the idea that what has gotten low-income minority communities into this state, and by minority we mean Black, is quick thought versus slow thought in the terms of Kahneman. That's clearly what is behind, that's clearly what drives these instances of murder. But why that became such common coin in these communities, I think something happens after 1965 that just changes the Overton window on violence in those communities. And it has nothing to do with Black DNA. But something happened to Black America. But the question is, what do you do now? Obviously,
And so let me
can't get rid of the guns. And so, what is the solution? And I do understand that.
Let me connect the other type of solution that I think we should be thinking a lot more about to your point about the change in the community, because you can see in the data there really is like a big rise in murder rates in the United States, starting in the mid '60s up through the early '70s. It's really quite striking in the data. So my hero in graduate school. So I'm an economics PhD student at Duke. I'm supposed to be like learning about stock price volatility and whatever. And like I had my Bible was William Julius Wilson's Truly Disadvantaged. I would like I'd hide it behind the economic textbook, and I'd be secretly reading. I was like, oh my God, if they catch me reading sociology, I'm going to get kicked out of grad school. And that book made a huge. So for those listeners who are not familiar, William Julius Wilson was, one of our truly great sociologists. Is one of our.
He's still living.
Is one of our great sociologists, and he argued that, like, starting in the mid '60s, middle class Black families moved out of the inner city as housing discrimination started to attenuate, and that led to an important source of like neighborhood resource to collapse.
Do you believe that, Jens?
I do.
This is eyes on the street. This is informal social control. I mean,
it's also the judge and the doctor and the school principal moved to the suburbs, and the poor people don't have a role model. That part of the argument.
No, sorry. No. Let's break up his theory into two pieces. Like, piece one is, did the middle class families move out? And piece two is, separately from that, like, that's a fact. Like, I think you can just see in the data that's
my parents. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fact. And then there's a separate question about, like, so then what is the mechanism through which that contributed to challenges in these neighborhoods? And like, maybe there's something to the role model theory. I don't know. But what I do know is, like, you drive around, I lived in Hyde Park on the South Side for 18 years. You drive around the South Side, you can see there are churches that clearly were once in much better condition and better resource than they are now.
Those beautiful buildings, yeah.
There's beautiful, the Woodlawn neighborhood just south of Hyde Park on the South Side of Chicago had a stretch of nightclubs where, world famous performers would perform for whatever, that are now totally gone. Like, Woodlawn is another one of these neighborhoods that has lost 50, 60, 70% of its population since the mid 1960s. And so, like, I think one of the reasons that that's so important goes back sort of to a different idea from the 1960s, which is, Jane Jacobs was writing in her wonderful book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. She was living on Hudson Street in the West Village. And she was looking around and noticing that similarly poor neighborhoods were super different in their levels of crime and violence. And, why is that? What's going on? And Jane Jacobs argued that was due to eyes on the street, which makes no sense under conventional wisdom. If it's bad people or poor people, what good is an eye on the street going to do? You're super motivated. You're going to wait for the eyes on the street to go around the corner and whatever. It's only the behavioral economics perspective that gives you a way to understand why the motivation for violence is fleeting. So why violence interrupted is violence prevented rather than merely violence delayed. And so I think, you can see on the South Side, what was Jane Jacobs arguing for? Things that would get people, pro-social adults, out of their homes, out into public spaces so they could help intervene and de-escalate things. Really hard to do when a ton of your houses are abandoned. A bunch of your lots are overgrown with weeds. There are used condoms, empty heroin baggies, needles. Like, that is not the sort of place that people want to go out in the public for. You can see this in the data because when some researchers from the University of Pennsylvania worked with the city of Philadelphia to randomly pick some vacant lots to clean up and others not, you can see in the survey data, like, neighbors now are much more willing to go out in the public. And in low-income neighborhoods, shootings go down by something like 30% in the vicinity of those, scary vacant lots turned into pocket parks, compared to similarly scary places that weren't fixed up, 30% fewer shootings. That is not a small effect. That is not a small effect. Right?
I think that's wonderful. I mean, it's fascinating. It's counterintuitive to me. I mean, I grew up in Philly. My family is of a very wide range of social classes. I can picture exactly those lots. I know exactly what that study is about. And the idea that you make it into kind of a lawn and there's less violence in the neighborhood, I'm so glad, because that is not something I would imagine. And that needs to be more people need to know about that.
Yeah, you would not think that things like urban design could be as potentially centrally important for a problem, a big seemingly intractable problem like gun violence.
Let me ask you something else, Jens. I was going to ask about gangs. I don't see much talk about gangs, and maybe it's because you don't think they're important. But in the folklore of urban violence, you hear talk about gang rivalry and that kind of thing. The other thing is about the family. You want kids to learn to ask for the ball, not to take it by force. You want to interrupt the cycle that leads psychologically to the ultimate act. Well, what about that training of a young person through the family institution to a maturity in which they understand these things?
Yeah, both great questions. So, on the gang front, I would say it is definitely true that there are gang wars over drug selling terms. Like, I don't want this to be misconstrued that, like, I don't see that that's a real thing that's happening. But it turns out that is a much smaller share of murders in American cities than people would. I think a lot of people, you watch The Wire, you think that is the entirety of the gun violence problem. And that is just a surprisingly modest share of the gun violence problem. It's a big problem on the west side of Chicago where the heroin highway takes the suburbanites in and out of downtown. They hop off, they buy their drugs. People are fighting about those drug selling corners, but that's not what most of the shootings are. I was with the gang homicide team sergeant a few years ago in the 70s in a neighborhood where the nickname is Terror Town on the south side of Chicago, and asking him about the most recent case that he's working on. And it was some teenager getting off the subway, walking down, he was in a gang, walking down the sidewalk, accidentally steps on the sneaker of another kid who happens to be in another gang. The kid whose sneaker stepped on said, "I think you should apologize," but probably not that politely. The other kid says, "I don't think I'm going to apologize," but probably not that politely. Someone winds up dead, someone winds up in cuffs. They happened to be in different gangs, but the gang structure was sort of incidental to the shooting in that case. And I think the data suggests it's like gang involved rather than gang motivated would be the key distinction that I would make there. And just very quickly on your question about families, my friend Melissa Carney is an economist who had a wonderful book come out a year ago called The Two-Parent Privilege,
Right.
that conceptually and empirically documents all the ways in which it seems to be better for kids to have two parents than one parent. I know that evidence much less well than Melissa. Maybe Glenn, you might know that research.
I just saw her at a conference presenting on the book, and it's very impressive.
Yeah, no, the argument for the importance of this, I think, is very impressive. Like the thing that I'd always taken away from the research literature, but maybe this has changed since the last time I looked at the data, is that we don't know very much about how to change family structure at large scale. And so, like, even if that's an important part of the story, I just don't know what we can do about it.
It's a hopeless case. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We can't change family. We can't change culture. We can't change guns, but we can teach kids how to de-escalate.
And we can design more forgiving neighborhoods by having more eyes on the street.
Talk about that then.
We can zone commercial in with residential. We can make the built environment inviting enough so it has an actual lively social environment. So there are adults around to step in and sort of de-escalate. And there are lots of experiments that show that, like, you improve street lighting, you get people out on the street, shootings go down. You fix up abandoned houses, people come out, shootings go down. You open stores in neighborhoods where there are not many stores, shootings go down. Right. So I think and this is not like liberal wishful thinking.
So this is James Q. Wilson, isn't it? This is broken windows?
Yeah, I think, it's a great question. I think that people like, I have a friend who was very high up at NYPD, and he said to me once, like, I think we at NYPD gave the broken windows idea a bad name. We did zero tolerance policing where we were just arresting everybody for every minor thing. But that's not really, there are other ways to fix broken windows, like fixing broken windows.
Right. No, I was about to say, I wasn't talking about policing methods. I was talking about environmental amenity and the indirect effect of that on something like violence, which you wouldn't necessarily automatically think of.
The only thing that worries...
The broken windows term has become associated with zero tolerance policing, but it need not.
The only thing that worries me about this idea that Hudson Street in Greenwich Village in New York should be a norm, and that it's a lovely street. It still is. But we need more housing, and including for poor people. And it would seem that it's going to mean verticality, especially in smaller cities, or if people are going to be together. To have all the housing that we need to build tall buildings to get people into. And right there, those are people the adults' eyes can't be on the street as much. Then we get into the housing project argument about how violence is fostered by people being penned up in tall apartment buildings rather than down on the street. But I imagine these are zoning questions that are beyond my ken.
Well, let me point out, like, the city of Chicago has lost 1 million residents since 1950. We were a city of roughly 3.7 million. We're closer to 2.7 million today. You don't need to build tall buildings to build housing. Downtown and on the north side of, the affluent north side of Chicago, that's true. But on the south and west sides of Chicago, you don't need to build tall buildings to house people, right? There's plenty of usable land there that you could build some combination of
2 and 3 floor dwellings, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Hope so.
What are the political prospects in our current time and initiatives of the sort that you're advocating, Jens, could actually get a majority behind them?
Well, so, I have come to think of myself as like a pathological pragmatist. And as one of the reasons that I like your show so much, it just is infused with pragmatism and just common sense thinking. And I try and aspire to do that in thinking about policy solutions. And so, I get why people in America have different views I've got my views about gun policy and whatever, but I can see that people have different views. People have different views about punishment and whatever. And we have all these fights around this stuff. But the sort of things that behavioral economics points to as being really, really useful in reducing shootings, I think have the potential to sidestep a bunch of these fights. Like, whatever you think about the Second Amendment, we can all agree that, like, delivering a behavioral economics social program in the juvenile detention center is better than watching 6 hours of Simpsons. Whatever you think about prison policy, we can agree that it's better to have a cleaned up vacant lot than a scary, like, trash dump with heroin needles and baggies and used condoms and whatever, especially when that gets us a bonus of like a 30% reduction in shootings in that vicinity. So I'm hoping that this is like a very pragmatic agenda that can get people excited in a way that sort of sidesteps all of these sort of big political fights that we've got in this sort of hyperpolarized moment. We'll see. I mean, the book is a test of that hypothesis, and we'll see how this plays out.
John, you got anything else?
No, because I'm trying to think pragmatically, and I'm settling all of this into my brain because I think that this is important. And it is true that nothing's going to happen about the guns. That's as hopeless as thinking people are going to start getting married again. So there needs to be something else. And I hope this works. There's a study actually now written, but I'm underslept, and so I can't remember the author, but there's a study that shows that I've said on this show that community centers don't work. Actually, they do work a little. And I was sent a wonderful study by somebody who I cited in one of my Times columns recently-ish, if anybody's interested. But I did not know that community centers, such as that cartoon that I created, actually do have an effect. And this seems related to that. It just needs to be brought up to scale so that you have significant falls, such as 30%, even 50%. I like that. I get it. I just wish something would work. Maybe it's this.
I have a final question that just occurred to me. Looking at the data trends over long periods of time in homicides per 100,000 in the US, you see rises and declines. Some of these rises and declines are really quite significant. I mean, the rise from the 1960s through the early 90s is really significant. The decline from the early 90s into our current time is really, really significant. How does that jibe with your theories about the micro origins of gun violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think let me answer that by tying it into like two very specific data points in the long-term trend. So this is going to be very hard for listeners to believe from a 2025 perspective, but I swear it's true. You can check the data. In 1991, the murder rate in Chicago, LA, and New York, the three biggest cities in the country, was identical at about 30 per 100,000. A way of comparison, the murder rate in London is typically like 1 or 2 per 100,000.
Right.
So just to remind us of how unusual America is. And, you know, in that moment, everybody in LA and New York, they were saying all the things about those cities that people in Chicago are saying today. The city's dying. There's nothing you can do about the gun violence problem. You got to leave, whatever. And in the 30 years, so this is 1991, peak of the crack cocaine epidemic. And in the 30 years that followed, the murder rate declined by nearly 80% in LA and nearly 90% in New York. Those cities, they didn't get rid of the guns. They didn't solve poverty. The poverty rates in those cities now are not that different from what they were back in 1991. The people in the city didn't like magically all disappear, but what those cities did do is I think they were early and rapid adopters of data-driven policing, which is to put police are a very important eye on the street. Put your paid eyes on the street in those places where gun violence is most likely to happen. And I think the second thing that those cities were early and rapid adopters of was investing in these community violence intervention groups that did a bunch of the sort of programs that we were talking about today. And so I think the other thing that I would maybe like end with on that is there are lots of people looking around the United States feeling like the gun violence problem is just hopeless. And I think what happened in LA and New York, your own city might have different politics and might not want to do what LA and New York did. I get that. But look at those cities and realize that huge change actually is possible. They didn't have behavioral economics written into their policy planning documents, but I think what they did in practice is very consistent with what I'm arguing for in the book.
It's a shame, though, that kind of policing is identified as a me meme now with coming down too hard on Black kids and putting Black people in jail for too long for small infractions, because that's not all it was. And I think the heart of it was something important. There's a branding problem.
Well, thanks, Jens. This is really important work that you're doing. It's a serious problem, and there are not many good ideas out there about what to do about it. I think your book is full of them. So appreciate
it's also very
the effort.
readable, folks.
Oh, thank you.
It is indeed. I mean, it
I don't have
warms
it
my heart.
Yeah.
I want to say this, John. It warms my heart to read this book about my hometown, because I look at the maps. I know these street names and neighborhoods and everything like that. Jens Ludwig, director of the Crime Lab at the University of Chicago, author of Unforgiving Places, The Hidden Origins of American Gun Violence, and a behavioral economist extraordinaire. Thank you very much for joining us, Jens.
Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jens.
Thanks so much.